Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about GDPR. We have a list of questions that we're going to run through that you guys added to our community thread over the next hour or so. We'll answer those questions. Also, please feel free to comment in the YouTube comment box online or add questions to our social media pages, and we'll do our best to pick those up. And we'll give you guys some we'll throw them at you guys and see if you can answer them. So we're ready with our donuts, and we're ready with your questions all prepared. But the one thing we want to say is here at Sovrn, we really want to be able to partner with you as publishers through this industry shift. And we're here to answer all of your questions, but this is not legal advice. So our goal is to be transparent with you and try to make our answers easy to digest. But we just don't want you guys to take this as legal advice.
Not lawyers.
We're not lawyers. Or they're not lawyers. Yes, only they're not. Okay, great. So we have Matt, our GM of data here at Sovrn, and Michelle, our compliance manager, and they have been living and breathing in GDPR world for the last 6 to 12 months.
It's a scary, scary world.
Yeah, so they are well prepared with the answers to your questions, and hopefully you guys can throw us some more throughout the hour. But the first question we have is for you, Michelle. It's from Terry, and she's wondering what's GDPR and what are the requirements? So pretty basic overview.
Yeah, so GDPR is EU regulation that goes into effect May 25th of this year, which is 2 days away. And it
actually technically went into effect like 2 years ago, but it's being enforced.
There you go. Yeah, it was written 2 years ago, so there's no grace period.
We're in the grace period.
It's getting real in 2 days.
And it's data and privacy rights that strengthen individuals' rights in the EU. So the main aspects to pay attention to, there's 99 articles, it's a large regulation, but some of the kind of core topics are that it expands the definition of personal data. So historically, you've probably thought about that as first name, last name, email, phone, and that now includes IP address and cookies. So that has a large impact to our industry. It's also not just relevant to the EU. If you're located in the EU, then it applies, but it's also if you're processing data about an EU individual, you also apply even if you're not located in the EU.
So a US publisher, anyone from the EU could come to their site.
Yep.
And their IP address and cookie ID is now personal.
Correct. So all of our industry is impacted by this. And another aspect is that data subjects or the individuals have rights to their data. So they can ask to have access, portability, deletion of that data. And you have to be able to respect those requests. So it's kind of a component of how to handle those and how to identify that information when someone asks for it. And then something to kind of be aware of is that there are large fines associated to this, and it enables people to have class action like lawsuits. So just to be aware of like why you should be applying this and adhering to the regulation itself.
Yeah. So it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're probably going to focus on like the cookie aspect of it and what happens when someone comes to your site. But there's also like internal stuff you need to do for documenting things. And
there's a large component of that. Like a lot of the regulation is about actually documenting the information and how you're complying with it across multiple facets. International data transfers, breach of data. There's a large aspect of it, but for publishers and their main focus, it's helpful for us to probably focus on kind of the information associated to your data partners and the roles and responsibilities across those.
Perfect. So based on that, publishers need to decide what legal basis they want to choose. And so one of our questions, our next question is from Alex. It's for you, Matt, and it's, how do you determine the legal stance to take as it pertains to GDPR? And the examples they gave were legitimate interest or consent. And what do you think are the most important factors to consider when making your decision between these two legal bases?
So the law lays out, like, I think 6 legal bases for saying you can process data for an EU resident's personal data under any of these 6 situations.
Right.
And in order to do that processing, you have to kind of establish which one of those is relevant. And in a publishing world, consent and legitimate interest are the 2 that kind of come up most relevant, unless you have a court order to process this person's data, which seems unlikely. For us at Sovrn, we feel like consent is a pretty gold standard, good, solid legal basis for publishers and the ad tech ecosystem to base all of their processing off of. So if you can get a reader to say, sure, go ahead and process my data, I'm totally cool with that, and you're transparent about all the things you're going to do with their data, that, and you have to document like the time that you got consent and things like that. But I think very few people would argue with that's okay, you have the right to go and do that. So consent is a good, solid legal basis, but it requires you do a little bit of extra work as a publisher to get that consent from the reader.
So legitimate interest is kind of like muddy area, like we're not too sure.
That's right.
Okay.
So so legitimate interest is a clause that says if you have a legitimate interest as part of fulfilling the services to the reader, you can process data for them. Then there's like recital 47 or something goes into like more detail about that.
Sure.
Yeah. I know you're a big fan of 47.
Totally read that.
But it's like you said, it's a little bit vague. So it says, you have to make sure that the context within which the person is interacting with you is appropriate, where they could expect their data to be processed and things like that.
So consent could be the better option for our publisher base.
It's a safe, clear, kind of much more black and white type of issue or way to establish that. I would say if you are going to go down a legitimate interest route, you have additional hurdles that you have to clear to be able to be sure that is appropriate in your situation. So it's more on a case-by-case basis, publisher-by-publisher basis, and you probably need to get a lawyer to review your situation to make sure that is appropriate for you, given the way your site is structured and the way you're presenting your data processing options to readers.
So then, did we go over the important factors to consider? I think so. So let's jump into a question from Steven. This one's for Michelle, and it's, what should I be asking my partners? So, I'm trying to navigate GDPR compliance. Everyone's telling me I need to ask my partners questions. What do I need to be asking?
Yeah, I think something to just note on that is everyone's trying to navigate this. So being fluid and candid with your partners is really good, and having those conversations to understand how they're approaching GDPR in general as well, and that they're even doing anything for compliance. But one of the big aspects to determine is what role do you and your partner have in relationship, and primarily between that of like who's a controller and who's a processor. Because establishing that between your partners helps you figure out what are your responsibilities and how do those relationships work. Do you need additional contracts in place? Do you need to understand how you work together on a data subject request, or having kind of those components outlined will be established between those relationships. And then some of the other things you should be asking are, what are they doing for internal compliance? How are they making themselves compliant? What are they doing to help me be compliant? And then what's their process and plan for the legal basis, which Matt just touched on, is not only do I have to determine my legal basis, but if they're also a controller, what legal basis are they operating on? So that you make sure you're in sync with strategies and how to handle that information together.
I remember like a couple weeks ago, Google came out and they were saying they're a controller, and some people sort of freaked out saying, oh, they're trying to like grab more power over the data, when I think in reality, just saying that doesn't mean you have more power over the data. It just sort of says, here's my obligations and how I need to fulfill our data relationship, right?
Yeah, like as a controller, that you're making decisions with some of that data, so it's not just I'm getting direction from you and I'm just processing it. But that could be a very different, perspective in what is that? What are you doing with that information? Doesn't mean that you're selling it or doing it. It could be I use and aggregate data across all of my partners to create insights and to better my services, but I'm making some directions based on my own decisions.
Kind of pretty low bar really to be a controller in terms of you need to do just a few things with the data and you're a controller.
Yeah, at least how probably a lot of us are interpreting it.
Yeah. That's a good point. A lot of this is still somewhat vague and
totally
interpretation.
I think that that's such a key point because I think one of the big things too is when you're talking to your partners, if they seem like, oh, it's cool, we got it, we know everything. I think it's good to be honest. Like we're all still navigating this. And so I guess do we want to talk a little bit about, we had a question, it's towards the end, I think, but about what our stance is at Sovrn.
Sure.
So if we're talking about what publishers should be asking their partners, can we touch on a little bit about, how we would answer those questions for publishers?
Sure. So my general philosophy for this and in life is to give the choice to the people you're working with and let them sort of figure out how they want to be treated given the amount of room for interpretation and gray area, and the fact that I've talked to 5 lawyers and gotten 6 different opinions on what's appropriate here. So at Sovrn, we feel like consent is reliable, good, solid way to establish basis for processing data, and we encourage all of our publishers to use a consent management platform to collect that consent from their readers in order to process data. If publishers who have been aware of the law for a while and taken good steps and been diligent and hired a lawyer who says, in this situation, if you do these things, we have a lawful basis established and we can make an ad call and ensure that we've protected all the rights of the EU residents in that call, then we support that option for a publisher to go into Meridian and select that they have already established a lawful basis for processing data, and then we will trust or we will work with them under that assumption that they've already established that lawful basis and process the reader's data under that.
So we're giving our publishers options, and they have the ability to go into the user interface and choose how they want us to handle their EU reader data.
That's right.
Do you want to talk about that at all, I guess, since you kind of brought it up? Anything else we need to add to it, or?
So we definitely support the ability to do non-personalized ads. And when a publisher says, hey, I haven't established lawful basis ourselves, Sovrn, you need to help with that, and we look for a consent from a reader and we don't find one, we will process that ad as a non-personalized ad, or internally we call them dataless, but it's a situation where we're not passing any cookie IDs, or we're truncating the IP address, and we're making sure that no one else is getting reader data in that situation.
The personal data has been removed.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Well said.
Perfect. So the next question.
One other thing we're doing is we consider ourselves, because we feel like our adding to the value of our data is kind of a core piece of what we do at Sovrn. We consider that we're a joint controller with our publishers. And so as such, to what Michelle was talking about earlier about giving readers access to the data, we've got on sovrn.com/yourdata, place where readers can come in and request what data we have on them and exercise all their rights. So we're supporting all those things that are our obligations as a joint controller.
Perfect. This actually led pretty nicely into our next question from Ross, which was, what is important to consider when shopping around for a CMP? What are the absolutely necessary features for a CMP to be compliant? And that one was for you, Matt. But I feel like you've been talking. So maybe a joint answer, but you can kick it off.
So I guess a little bit of background on the CMPs first. So there, at the beginning of the year, I was looking around saying, how do we communicate with all of our partners? We work with dozens of advertisers and DSPs. How do we work with them to communicate consent back and forth? And thankfully, a little bit late in the game, but the IAB stepped in with a proposal for a framework that said, here's how all the different businesses within the ad tech ecosystem can communicate whether consent has been given for a reader. And so that's this IAB framework, and we support that and think it's one of the only games going in town to be able to communicate consent back and forth.
Why is it important to have like our CMP based off of the IAB framework?
Because we're in a fragmented. We're not a monopoly, so we can't just say, hey, we're just working with this one other partner. Everyone has to talk the same language, and the IAB framework is a good way for us to be able to communicate to the Trade Desk, to Google, to all the different people who want to bid on a publisher's ad inventory, that they can all speak the same language around consent. So that was only really released in early March. So it's been a bit of a mad the ecosystem to build tools that are built off of this framework. But it's a great way for a publisher to get consent and then let everyone else know, here's who got consent.
Got it.
In terms of
functionality.
Sure, who's out there? I mean, because all the tools are going to be based, all the tools you probably want to work with are based off of this IAB framework, the set of functionality that's offered are going to be fairly consistent. Some folks have done some nice ability to customize things, and I don't know.
Some different bells and whistles. Everyone's kind of taken a different stance on what you can customize, from language to colors to making it your own kind of feel. I feel like those are all kind of similar with some small differences in there.
But at the end of the day, they're really all about providing a message to the reader and saying, here's what we're going to do with your data, and then letting them have the choice.
And that message has to be kind of consistent across, because it has to meet, requirements for being like clear, unambiguous. The user actually has to explicitly consent in. It's not an opt-out. It needs to be just as easy to give consent as it is to not give consent.
Right.
So there's a lot of those components that everyone is complying with and interpreting that into the CMP.
I hope that everyone's.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So at the end result of that, you set a string on the person's browser that says, here's the partners that the person has given consent to, and that's really what it's all about, is getting to that. Beyond the basic functionality and the customization, price, and working with a partner that you trust who can explain these things to you and talk to you and give you feedback on how to implement that. I think it is sort of the important thing, and where we focused at Sovrn.
So the differentiators are really, if you're going to pay for it or not, if you get support for implementing it, and if it's easy to implement.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. We've gone with a kind of container solution, so it's one tag on the page to implement that. I'd also add that that's really it's the core, the main functionality. There's also another piece that publishers need to make sure that they also do, which is make sure that their ad calls all have access to that consent that the reader has specified, and that that last step of the implementation is also taken care of, so that the ad ecosystem can act off of that consent stream.
And part of that is making sure that if you're going that route, that your partners that you're working with have signed up for the IAB registry list.
Yeah.
Global vendor list.
Global vendor
yeah.
list.
So, because if they're not on that list, they're not going to be included in that string that you've worked so hard to pass that consent.
But everyone's going to have to be on there eventually.
Hopefully. We actually had a question come through from Paul asking, how easy is it to install consent tools on my website? Who wants to take that one? I think we kind of touched on the fact that our CMP is easy to implement, but I guess we could go into a little bit more about the one tag solution.
It should be really simple. It's one line of code that is for the CMP itself, and then there's a separate piece of code that every CMP needs, which is called the stub, and that's something that goes along with the CMP. It's a fail-safe. It helps pass that consent string. So it's two pieces of code that you're putting into your header to have that fire. So it should be a simple, easy solution to have, and then it automatically detects if that user's in the EU or not through an IP address to determine if that consent should be presented to the user.
Perfect. And I think if you're a Sovrn publisher and you use one tag, then you would just be able to implement it within that, and you wouldn't have to put extra code on your page other than the stub.
Yes.
So, okay.
Yeah. So you can implement it into the same container and just have another configuration within that.
Because I know a lot of people care about latency, so I think that's always helpful to minimize the code on the page. Cool. Let's see, where are we? So, this is a good question. So from Alex, what are your recommendations for a publisher with a smaller amount of EU traffic?
I think there's a couple areas you can evaluate it. It's how much do you want to evaluate based on what's important for you and your revenue associated to coming into compliance. So you have different options. I mean, we offer what we're calling dataless or anonymized solution as well. So if it's something that you are nervous about and not sure, you're not ready to implement a CMP, you can go to the option of still allowing your users to access the content and providing an option to try to monetize through a dataless solution. But a CMP should be another easy access solution to you. I know that the CMPs in general are pretty easy to implement, like we just talked about. So you're able to implement a CMP and try to get consent where available, and you can still rely on that data list if you're not getting consent.
If you want to go the full sort of super conservative route, you can also totally block EU traffic. Now, what you can't do is ask for consent for someone, and if they don't give it to you, then you say, well, forget you, I'm not going to serve you any content. That's not cool under the law.
You just don't have to offer your services to the EU in general. So it's all or nothing kind of approach with that.
Right. And I don't know that anyone specifically, that's probably something a publisher would have to implement themselves to just say no traffic from the EU if they wanted to go that route. But I mean, that's the closest. I don't think there's anything that's like 100% fail safe. I think even the website for the EU Parliament was dropping cookies and was not GDPR compliant. So it's going to be really hard to be 100% compliant for everyone. But that one I think is if you are super concerned about this and it's not worth, you don't have the resources to hire a lawyer and do all of the more thorough things, and you just say, I'm not going to work with the EU, that is an option that some publishers might want to take.
Gotcha. I know we've been talking about this internally a lot, and it kind of just sounds like it's up to the publisher, whatever is best for them.
Yeah.
But if they work so hard to get this readership internationally, then perhaps the CMP can be a good option.
It's a good point, and the fact is that the advertisers in the EU are still going to be looking to spend their budgets, and they're still going to be advertising. And if there isn't the opportunity to target the way they had been in the past, and they need to buy contextually, and you've got awesome content on your site that advertisers want to go and spend money for those ads, that you can still absolutely monetize, and who knows where that goes, it may end up being not as big a deal as we fear.
So you just have to do what's best for you, I guess it sounds like. We had a question come through along these lines. Will there be revenue loss for publishers with GDPR? What ways do you see publishers mitigating this loss? Subscriptions is in parentheses as a question mark. So I think that might be one option. But can you guys speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it probably depends on what solution you're offering. And I could say like probably come May 25th when people are starting to turn on their solutions, that they'll probably see a drop in revenue, because if it's dataless, maybe not everyone has switched over to bidding on contextual yet. Or, hey, you're still working to crawl and get consent if you're offering it. You need to start prompting users to provide that acknowledgement or not. So you'll probably see a decline in some of your revenue associated to it. But I feel like over time that could just come up a little bit as the industry adjusts and shifts to.
And readers start giving consent, and that consent is persistent for a little bit, then you'll be totally fine. But it's going to change for sure. I think whatever happens on Friday, we'll have a burning in period for a month or two where things will change and advertisers will figure out how they want to behave differently, and more consent will get acquired.
And I think a lot of people are really unsure how to expect for what will happen on Friday entirely. Like what kind of consent rates are we going to get across the industry? What are happening? And a lot of that information will evolve over time, and we'll have more insights to be able to adjust to see like how is the EU traffic and monetization working.
So it's like a little bit of a waiting game. We're just going to see kind of how it goes, and publishers should somewhat do the same, because we don't necessarily know what to expect in revenue loss or things around those lines just yet.
Yes, and again, I think it'll continue to evolve. Like, it's not going to be settled, and whatever happens on May 25th is the way it is.
Right.
It's gonna change.
Yeah, sure. Okay. This leads really nicely into this question from Jared. What should we be aware of when the law goes into place? So I think more around the lines of like, what do we expect to happen? I know we don't necessarily know, but maybe things also to keep in mind, or things we should be aware of.
There's a lot of ambiguity with the law, and there's a lot of things that are being interpreted differently. So I think over time we'll really see some of how that outlines itself a little bit clearer, and identifying some of those holes or question marks of what does this mean, and how should we be acting upon this, this regulation. I think that will be the biggest thing to watch and see, is how do we respond and evolve to that clarity that comes into place.
Right, and I think most of our publishers are not going to be getting letters from a EU regulation authority like on Friday. In fact, I think probably they'll be busy with Google and Facebook for a while. But Michelle mentioned earlier that an individual can claim their rights under this law. So that's probably going to be the first exposure that our publishers have to this law, is a reader saying, hey, what data do you have about me? And potentially I want that data deleted. So I recommend that our publishers focus on being able to provide that support.
And if you haven't started yet, I think some of this is, gotten a lot of traction over in the US, like actually identifying, oh, this does apply to me. Don't panic, but, start making the efforts to coming into compliance. What steps can you take, now that you know that it does, and what can you do? Start taking those steps to be coming into compliance and working towards it.
And you're not alone.
You're not alone. That's true. And I think at Sovrn, we tried to put together some easy steps to take and checklists for publishers. So if you haven't come across those yet, they're on our website, and I think that they would be really helpful if you really haven't gotten started yet. We always try to break things down so it's a little bit easier to understand, and there's just so much jargon being thrown around with this GDPR stuff that it's probably, it can be frustrating at times. So also give us feedback if you feel like you aren't getting what you need from us. We'll keep diving into questions here. We went over what Sovrn's stance on GDPR. So Michelle, this one's from Greg. How does the CMP know if a user is in the EU? And we may have touched on that too.
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit, but our CMP is looking for the IP location from the browser and identifying that and determining if it's an EU IP to fire that UI for the user to be prompted for consent or not.
Right. Now that's not 100%.
I don't think
reliable.
Yeah, I
right?
mean, it's determining something based off of, what's being provided and how accurate are those IP addresses in general and identifying that. So it's important to understand like what capabilities are associated with that.
I mean, I think I should maybe restate that I think the granular level of geo accuracy of an IP address is not that great, but at a country level, it's pretty darn reliable, and a user would have had to like take explicit action to cover up their IP address, which I feel like it's hard to account for all the crazy actors out there that are. So I think right now IP is sort of the best bet.
Yeah, and you can only act on the information that is being given to you. So if someone's deliberately trying to hide the fact that they're in the EU or something, I mean.
Yeah. It's kind of an edge case.
Yeah, I don't see people really doing that, but.
I just thought of this because I think I heard this question earlier this week from a publisher. But when you implement the CMP, how can you see if, and you're in the US, how can you see what it would look like to an EU reader? Do you guys happen to know?
Yeah, I mean, I know that is on one of the things that we discussed that we need to help build for our publishers is like a testing mode to allow them to see it.
Use like a VPN on their site to see what it would look like as an EU user?
Yeah, that might be a solution.
Okay.
I know, did you follow up with the product manager on that one? I don't know where we ended up.
I think we've added some directions onto our implementation guide for the publisher to be able to go through some testing steps to be able to see kind of what it looks like for a user themselves.
Mm-hmm. I think when I had this conversation earlier this week, I think we suggested a VPN, and you can get these free VPNs that you would just put into your browser, and then if you choose a country in the EU, then you can browse as if you're looking at your site from that country. And I think this is a good point just because you want to be able to see what the CMP will look like on your site to an EU reader. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
We should definitely do that.
Yeah. And then I'm getting a few questions coming through. So,
Can I also on that one just mention, so like we have our office in London.
Right.
Who sort of testing and leading the charge really on building our CMP. Probably worth noting that even though Brexit and the UK may not be in the EU for that long, everything I've been told is that this law is essentially mirrored in the UK as well. So it applies equally. So we're preparing for one thing for the EU, including the UK.
Sure. Okay. So then the question I was going to ask was, based on what you guys were talking about earlier, can readers go to companies and ask for the data the company has on them? What will that look like? So I know we are prepared for that.
Mm-hmm.
So can you guys speak to that a little bit?
Yeah.
Maybe what publishers can prepare for?
So that's an individual acting on their data subject rights. So they can ask for access, portability, deletion, and ask any controller of that their personal data for that information. So it probably depends which company you're going to, what that data is going to look like. because it's all associated to the data that they've collected.
And when they ask for the data, it's supposed to be sort of the same mechanism to ask for your data as it can't be super hard. You can't say, well, you have to get a stamp and mail me a request to get my data, and I will then, deliver it to a PO box, and that you have to be able to get it sort of the same way that you collected the data in the first place. So for us, we have a website that a reader can go to and request their data from a form. And so I'd recommend as a publisher you do a similar type of approach.
Gotcha. And then I'm just going to read this question. What are other ways publishers can start targeting audiences while still being GDPR compliant? Not sure.
Sure. So, I mean, consent is sort of the big one. As long as the reader has said, sure, that's fine, you can give me personalized ads or whatever the purpose is that you've asked the reader to give. If they've granted that, you can still target them that way. I mean, I mentioned kind of contextual targeting is a little bit going back to the dark ages of 2004 or whatever. But for sure, advertisers can say anyone who's coming to this site is clearly, or this page or this section of my site is clearly interested in whatever autos, and so maybe I'll serve auto ads, and I could do could set up a PMP preferred with a publisher to sell that content as a private marketplace to buyers. So
another potential opportunity is looking at other metrics like viewability. You can identify different aspects that aren't necessarily collecting like personal data associated to that viewability. So having that as another key identifier is that this person's engaged with my site, even if you don't know anything else connected to that information.
So today, reader specific targeting, the cookie ID it's such a predominant way that advertisers decide where to show their ads. We have done tests where we see a pretty dramatic change in the amount that a publisher will earn from an ad when we don't pass a reader ID. I'd say that test is not valid starting on May 25th because advertisers are going to change the way they target. So I think a lot of it is we're going to have to hold our breath a little bit and work with advertisers to make sure that they're finding the content that they want to show their ad on, if not the reader.
Perfect. I guess we can jump into the last question we've received. I think there's another one that came through live, but first let's answer this one. So from Peter, I've received so much communication about updating T's and C's. What should I pay attention to? So valid question.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think I've received like a million emails.
Everyone's doing it, essentially. Everyone's like updating their language, their privacy policies, all of those things, and generally for language associated to what probably their role is, how they handle data subject requests, if they need to appoint a DPO, how to contact that person, which is a data protection officer.
And it's not necessarily like bad that they're trying to like change the terms on you and like grab more. They're not trying. I don't know. I haven't seen anyone do this. I can't say for sure, but it doesn't seem like folks are doing this to try to change their relationship with you. They're just trying to comply with the disclosure and the transparency requirements in the law.
Yeah, it should be primarily around a lot of those changes. I'd say definitely try to read them, go through that, take those steps to make sure that you are comfortable with what they're putting in that language, and identifying like if they are establishing a role within that you feel comfortable with the role that they're playing and that you're playing in that. So taking the time to go through those. If you have an enormous amount of them, obviously identifying a way to prioritize like what's important for my services and understanding those new terms. But generally, yeah, I think it's just primarily about figuring out those disclosures and providing you more viewability and insight into what that company is doing in preparation for this.
Yeah, the law definitely has like a big component of it around transparency and describing in plain language what you're actually doing. They don't say it has to be plain language and short. So I think all of the policies, including ours, got a lot longer as the lawyer said, oh, you need to talk about this and this and this. So they get painfully long. But mostly it's about saying, here's people we work with, here's what we can do with the data, here's how you opt out, here's our data retention policy, DPO, like there's a whole bunch
There's a lot of information.
Things that need to be disclosed.
And I guess something to like mention is that this regulation isn't replacing anything in other countries or in other areas. So, you know, you still have to adhere to US regulation if you're here. And so adding this information, those are just getting probably maybe a little bit longer because I still have to have the same or different disclosures for the US requirements as I do now for the EU. So there's different layers now to that information and trying to build upon that to be, I mean, the internet is worldwide, so complying across different areas is important.
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated.
Yeah, there are so many layers, it sounds like. It's just probably hard to digest.
Yeah, but I think understanding whether the partners that you work with are controllers or processors, understanding what obligations are under each of those situations, understanding kind of what legal basis they're using to operate for personal data, and then like how you can work with them if there's an issue, there's a breach or a request for information.
Yeah.
That's right.
I would probably just add that, you know, at Sovrn, we're always available for questions. Like we will always answer our publishers' questions. So if anyone's confused about what we're doing on our end, just reach out. Our support staff is always on call. We have the community, which is a great place to ask questions about this kind of stuff. So join if you're not a member. And I just, our goal is to be as transparent as possible. So we're always available.
As much as we can.
Yeah,
I wish
mean,
there were
we'll answer what we can, right?
hard and fast answers on all these things.
Yeah, sure. So we just had another one come through back to the CMP, the consent management platform, and that's how long does user consent last? Do you suggest re-asking for consent after a certain period of time? And I think this goes across any CMP.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not specifically called out in the law that like when you give a consent for a cookie, it needs to last for this many days. There's like this kind of I'll know it when I see it kind of attitude in the law of saying it's got to be reasonable and in line with the scope of what you're asking for.
And there's an expiry set to that consent string. So, and in our CMP, it's configurable, but you can change it as a publisher to determine how you feel comfortable with. We have like a minimum amount of time that you can re-ask for consent or maximum. So it's just something that each CMP is also interpreting in what they're set for that. So it could be a default or it could be something that's configurable upon your CMP in determining that. But
I've definitely seen as long as 13 months. Someone gives consent that it lasts for 13 months, and I've seen others that are as short as 30 days. And that seems reasonable, but I think it's appropriate to say, hey, as a publisher, I have to balance the rights of the readers with how often this is going to annoy them and what the consumer experiences.
And it's also something to consider of like, how often do you change some of your strategy? Because if you're adding a new partner into something like, then you need to add that person into the consent and re-prompt users that have already provided. So it's kind of it's a balancing act for how you how you approach that, and then getting that person integrated.
Because the consent is only valid for the people you included in the list at the time when you asked the person for consent. And then you want to work with another partner, or God forbid, one of the partners that you work with wants to add another partner, you have to reacquire that consent.
Yeah. And especially right now, I think people are still joining the global vendor list. It's getting updated daily right now. So it's something to be aware of, like May 25th, people still could be getting onto that registry. So it's something to pay attention to, of like, where are my partners in that process? And so that you know if they're being presented to your user for consent or not.
Yeah, definitely not all of the partners that we work with are in that list yet. Encouraging them to hurry up and do that.
Register.
Yes.
Awesome. I think those are all the questions we have that have come through today and over the last week or so. So unless there's anything else we want to add, we could probably wrap it up a little early, I guess.
I just tell publishers to take a step back, breathe through it. It's going to be fine. Like, work through it, show your compliance, show the steps that you're taking to get there, and just be aware that there will be continuous changes to this. So it doesn't end on Friday. It's just the start. And we're going to be watching and figuring out how this all kind of comes together, especially over the next couple months. So you might still be getting communications. You might still be seeing a lot of interpretation and adjustments. And so to provide insights to us as well if they're experiencing things, and we're here to support and learn from you, but you'll also see from us some of that information going the other way of like, we're learning through this together.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for joining this
Hillary.
morning and offering some great advice to our publisher base. And thanks to all of you for listening. And yeah, we hope it goes well on Friday, and yeah, fingers crossed. Okay, thanks.